My name's Matt Wood, and I'm the head of housing at Hudson Architects. And I've been interested in all sorts of housing for probably 15 to 20 years. Before that, I was mostly doing retail and a lot of urban sort of high-rise housing. But these days I do a lot of suburban housing estates. And we work for a mixture of private developers and house builders and people who are obviously building their own homes, individual self-builders.
Our conversation started discussing this radical new policy for Norwich, Broadland and South Norfolk, and the requirement that any new developments of 40 dwellings or more would have at least 5% of those 40 would be service plots for self-builders. And I know that there was a bit of a mixed reaction within the team on whether would that be something that people were interested in. And our conversation developed into understanding, well, what does that actually look like? What does that mean? So maybe you could start by summarising, what does that actually mean to have a service plot for self-builders?
So a serviced plot is a piece of land that's big enough to have a house built on it. But in the past, self-build in this country has been delivered largely just on one-off sort of leftover bits of land. And you have typically a bit of a field or the back end of a garden, and you have to basically sort everything out from scratch. So you have to put in an access from the highway. You have to lay on water and electricity and gas if it's available from the utilities companies, all of which are separate agreements and separate prices. And you then also have to go and get planning permission, which is never a straightforward process. So traditionally, self-build has been really an activity for genuine enthusiasts, and people with a lot of time, some understanding of the system perhaps, certainly plenty of money, and also that are willing or able to take a risk with some of that money in terms of going into something that's inherently uncertain and quite difficult. So that's what self-build in this country has previously been. But the idea of a serviced plot is that, particularly a group of serviced plots as part of a larger housing development, the idea is that the developer would already have got planning permission for those plots, probably in the form of outline permission, which would establish the use of that land as being suitable to have a house on it. So planning is taken care of, at least in outline terms. And while they're putting in all of their utilities for all of the other houses on the site, the developer, the house builder, would build you the road that gave access to your plot, would bring gas, water, electric and data to the edge of your plot with simple connections for you to sort of plug into. So it's a really very different kind of way of delivering land to self-builders, and the government is really hoping that it'll lead to a sort of step change in the rate of provision and uptake for self-build. So that's why it's really very exciting, a real game changer in terms of the sort of volume of land that's available.
These plots, they either have to be self-build or custom build. Can you explain what the difference is between those two things?
So the policy that we're talking about in the what they call it, the Greater Norwich Local Plan, the GNLP, the policy refers explicitly to self and custom build. Other policies in different bits of the world, different bits of the country, don't refer to custom build, they just talk about self-build. But the basic difference is self-build is classic old-fashioned way of doing things. You find a piece of land that would take one house, and the self-build is a bit misleading because hardly anybody actually physically builds their house. Really, it should probably be called self-procure or self-commission, because the vast majority of self-builders actually hire an architect to design with them their dream home, and they hire a building contractor to build the home. So self-build is a bit of a misnomer anyway, but self-build is that traditional one occupier, one house type of model, is defined slightly differently in various places, but the key feature is that it's typically a group of houses. Crucially, the builder is probably also the developer, i.e. the owner of the land. So in the case that we're talking about, on a large housing estate, the house builder will be building lots of houses on the site, and their intention would be to build individually these custom build houses. But rather than building them to plans that they already have drawn up or used elsewhere, they work with a future occupier to design the house to that occupier's particular requirements. And that's the absolute essence of custom build. By the strict definitions, or the definitions that are in the Custom Build Housing Act, the plans mustn't already exist. So it's not a question of choosing the tiles in the bathroom or the door fronts in the kitchen. It has to be more substantial with that. And the developer has to work with the occupier to design and develop the house.
Okay. With these plots, are there sort of rules and regulations that you have to adhere to?
Yes, so obviously the first step in the chain is the planning permission, which typically would be just outlined. So it would normally say, this is a plot of so-and-so many 100 square meters, and it can take a house of this size, 150 square meters. And everything else about the house has to be planning approved at a later date, typically when the land has been sold and the purchaser is sort of designing their house. So you have to come back and get detailed planning permission to flesh out the bare bones of the outline permission. But also when you buy the house, it tends to come with what they call a plot passport, which is really a list of instructions on what you can and can't do on the plot. So I've already mentioned that almost invariably there'll be a limit on the size of the house that each plot is allowed to take. Almost always there'll be a limit on the height of the house. Typically that will be the number of stories, number of floors in the house, plus perhaps an overall height limit, on let's say the highest ridge of the highest roof. It will typically also give you distances from the boundaries at the side and front and rear of the house that you can't build in. So that's to stop you getting too close to the neighbours or too close to the highway. It will tell you then other things like how many parking spaces you've got to provide. It might go so far as to say it has to have a pitched roof, or it has to have a flat roof, or it has to be built of certain materials. But the simpler the plot passport, the better, has been the general thrust of things up till now.
So does that mean, in theory, you could end up with quite an interesting mix of houses visually?
Yes, absolutely. They call it, in parts of the world where this is more common, particularly in Holland, which is really sort of the kind of absolute exemplar of how to do all different sorts of self and custom build. They refer to this as, they call it the architectural zoo, which is where you get very, very different houses all next to each other in a street, in the same way that you walk past and see different animals in their cages, as it were, which some people find really exciting and attractive. Other people find it quite weird and a bit sort of headachy. But how similar or different the houses look is something that you can control with that set of instructions that I've talked about with the plot passport. So for instance, your plot passport might say all houses are to have pitched roofs with a minimum pitch of 40 degrees. And immediately that would give you something that would make the houses kind of hang together. And if you then specify they have to be built of one of these three following bricks, and the windows must have vertical divisions only, the more you write down, the more you could, if you wanted to gel the whole thing together. Another way that you can provide some consistency is to make sure that everybody has the same treatment to the front boundary. There's an example locally near Barton called Long 4 Acres, which had a quite loose design code. So it has this kind of element of the architectural zoo, but the treatment along the pavement, every plot has to have the same hedge specified. So over time, the hedge will grow in and the plots will tend to look unified by how they're treated along the front. So there's different ways of doing it. I think developers would, at the moment, most self-builders are looking for individuality to express themselves. So I think in the first instance, developers might be inclined to write fewer rules rather than more. But I think as the market develops, I think people might want to have some sense of what the overall look and feel of the street is going to be. So I think in the future, these plot passports or design codes, this is another name for them, might become more and more detailed, just to give people more of a sense of, the street in which they'll be living when they've designed their own house.
And in East Anglia, in Norfolk, is this something that is already quite common, or is it newer territory?
Yeah, so at Hudson Architects, we do a lot of self-build, but it's the traditional self-build. It's, people who've managed to find a piece of land have come to ask us to design with them a house. That market is quite well established, but it's at a relatively low, doesn't produce many homes over the course of a year. And whereas what's really exciting about this initiative is potentially it has the facility to really boost the numbers. As such, there aren't that many examples of what we might call this sort of housing estate version of it, if you like. There is only really one example that I've mentioned already. It's the one at Long 4 Acres in Mulbarton, which I think is 14 plots, 12 or 14 plots, all sold, all built. So that's proved that there's a market for it. But I think the fact this new policy is in the emerging plan, so the plan isn't adopted until sometime next year. So I think it's going to take a year or two for this to filter through. And the other thing about it is these big housing developments, 40, 60, 80, 100 dwellings, they take several years to come through the system. So my feeling is what we're looking at here is kind of get ready, it's coming. Start thinking about it now. If you think it's an option for you, get ready for when these plots really do start to come onto the market.
And are there any big success stories further afield that you'd recommend people interested in self-build have a look at?
Yes, there's a very good website by the National Custom and Self-Build Association, the rather awkwardly entitled NACSPA, which is really worth looking at. It has loads of really, really good case studies on it. The biggest one in this country is over by Oxford, a place called Bicester, just outside Oxford, on a development called Graven Hill, most of which is self-build plots, and they've built dozens and dozens, if not hundreds by now, of houses on a self-build method. So that's worth definitely looking at online or even going to visit. But as I say, that's going to be happening more and more. Abroad, part of the whole point of this is that on the mainland Europe and most of the northern hemisphere, self-build accounts for between 40 and 70% of all new homes that are built, whereas in Britain it's only 10%. So most other countries have self-build like we can't imagine, and the obvious one, partly because it's so close, but also partly because it does it so well, is Holland. So there are all sorts of entire new towns, Graven Hill. The one that people go to very often, or site very often, is called Almere in Amsterdam, I think that is, which is a new town entirely built of self-build plots. So it's out there, and that website, the NACSPA website, is a really good place to start.
And if someone was considering this approach, how much input does the buyer have in the construction of this property? When we say self-build, do you get to choose your own contractor?
Yeah, so in the scenario where it's a self-build, the implication there, or the route there, is that the self-builders, the self-commissioners, are buying pieces of land. That's all they're buying. Well, sorry, they're buying a piece of land plus the rules, if you like, the rule book. And they then have total control over what they do, provided it's within the rules. So they have to go and hire an architect or draw their own plans if they feel up to it, and then go and find a builder. And really, they're sort of doing everything for themselves. And a lot of self-builders do some of the work. Some do all of it, but not that many. If you're going the custom build route, then you're working with a developer who will often also be the builder. The house builders tend to do that model. They develop their own sites and build their own houses. And there, the range, I think, is less well defined, but as I say, it's got to be more than choosing tiles or do you want this wall or not, as it were, dividing two rooms. And really, it would probably, I would imagine in the medium term, it would be working with that developer's chosen architect to develop your house design. So in an ideal world, really, you get all the freedom of the self-build route in terms of the design, but somebody else is taking care of the pricing of the project and actually delivering it and ensuring the quality is up to scratch and all the rest of it. So custom build is, I think, where the government certainly thinks we ought to end up.
That's really interesting. How do you think the developers, how do they feel about this proposal of that 5%?
Right. Well, they're required to provide affordable housing. That's how we provide affordable housing in this country largely. There are quotas on large developments. So they're not unused to the idea of having to do certain things with certain bits of land. But I think they will probably be, and I've spoken to a few about it over the years, I think they will generally be quite resistant to the idea, have been quite resistant to the idea. At the moment, you really have two profit margins if you're a house builder. You make some profit on securing planning permission, of turning a field, a farmer's field, into a development site. That increases its value by 10 to 20 times. That's a real chunk of money. Any builder developer will also make another profit margin on piling up bricks and wood to make a house. So the price that they can sell the house for is worth more than the cost of the materials that to build the house, materials and labour. So they have really two profit margins, one on the land and one on the house. The problem with this, obviously, is that they're losing, particularly if it's self-build, they're losing one of those profit margins because they're just selling a piece of land. They're not selling a house. And I think in this self-build model, they've got a bit of their development that's got 10 or 20 or however many individual projects going on. And each one of those projects has a delivery van of bricks and a delivery van of, turf. And there's quite a process to be managed, which I think a lot of developers just think will be a headache. On the plus side, self-builders typically buy the land or the custom built house at a very early stage. So they'll give you the money up front. House builders will sell a few of their houses on any given estate off plan and get the money early, but for every one of these plots, they'll be getting the money up front. So there should be some cash flow advantages to developers to be had. So I think there's probably been some resistance, if I'm honest, but it's policy now. So, it is what it is.
And if someone's considering the self-build or custom-build approach, what are the sort of big things that can go wrong that you might want to be aware of?
Right. Well, really what I've talked about is that a lot of the big risk items, the really big risk items are things like access from the highway, being able to get utilities connections at a decent price and on time. Planning is a massive risk item that can go badly wrong. The actual piling up of the bricks and timber to make a house is relatively straightforward. I mean, things do go wrong, and you need to have a really trustworthy builder or an architect that's keeping an eye on things for you. But the whole point about these serviced plots is that they should be really taking a lot of the big risk items out of the process for an aspiring self-builder. So that's the really big kind of the big news.
And in terms of architecture, how much freedom is there in choosing the architect you'd like to work with?
Well, not all architects have got a lot of experience of working with owner-occupiers. A lot of smaller local architects do have that sort of experience, and it's a distinct skill, being able to work with people, understand what the words that a client or customer is saying to you, what they might mean in terms of how you actually design, So there's a kind of understanding what's in people's heads, being used to helping them get that brief out in the open, whether that's using reference images or Pinterest boards or what have you. So you need to choose somebody that's got a track record of working with individuals to design their own home, and you need to choose somebody whose previous work you have a kind of enjoyment of. So if you want a neoclassical house, there's not much point. You would find it harder work if you went and hired an architect who's got only flat roof modernist boxes in their back catalogue. So looking at architects' websites and seeing what sorts of houses they've designed in the past, that's probably the starting point. But most small local architects have got experience of this and would be able to give you all of the pointers in terms of how you get hold of a builder, how you get through building regs, all the rest of it really.
And so what would you say is the first step? Is it finding your plot or is it finding your architect?
Well, in this case, I think the first step is neither of those. I think the first useful thing that all self-builders should be doing locally is to get their names onto a thing called the custom build register with each of their local planning authorities. So the government has been pushing to increase the popularity of self-build for actually about 10 years now. Our local MP, Richard Bacon, has been really, really instrumental in pushing this through. He leads an all-party group on this in Parliament. And the first concrete step towards increase in self-build was that they placed a requirement on all local planning authorities to maintain a register of people who are interested in self-building. And that register is really important because the number of plots that a local authority has to approve, give planning permission for, is related to the demand in their local area. So people going on the register is a really important way of keeping up the supply of plots. It has been a bit frustrating for people on the register because there has not been a requirement for these local authorities to actually provide the plots. They just have to know how many people want them. So it's been very frustrating for the trailblazers, going onto these registers. But I would say that's an important thing. And the other thing it does is just about the sort of the baseline of what you get out of it is that you will be notified. I think most registers are run such that you're notified when plots are approved. So you get a kind of heads up on what plots are coming through the system. And then it's a question of just keeping an eye out on that and in the local press, because of course, in exactly the same way that house builders advertise their wares through estate agents, new homes on development X, Y, and Z. When they've got self-build plots to sell, they're going to be popping up in estate agents as well. So, that will start to happen in due course. Once you've located a piece of land, then you can sort of start thinking about an architect and whether or not you need a contractor, i.e. whether it's self or custom build. But I think that first thing, getting yourself onto the register, you can be on more than one register. So you don't have to, if you live in South Norfolk, you're not limited to being on that one register. So if you lived in Norfolk, you could be on all of the 7 districts registered if you would fancy living anywhere in Norfolk. So that's probably the first step.
And what kind of plots can people expect? Are these, as they're going to be rural plots or urban plots? Is it a big mix?
Well, almost by definition, these larger developments, so 40 plus units, by definition, they have to be in a sustainable location. One of the big tests for where new homes are allowed to be built is they have to be built in a sustainable location. Typically, that means next to a settlement, a town or a village that's got a range of local services, schools, shops, pubs, healthcare, all the rest of it, public transport. So they will tend to be self-built plots on the edges of larger developments, larger housing estates. If I was a developer, I would want to make sure that the self-built plots were, had a nice, attractive, quiet corner of my site. That's how I would drive the most value out of them. So they're likely to be on the edge of a larger housing development, and that housing development is likely to be on the edge of a town or a village that's got a range of services, which of course is another brilliant advantage of this policy, whereas before you had to take a plot wherever you could find it. And the chances are you'd end up out in the sticks somewhere or in a completely different part of the county that you weren't expecting. And that's where the plot was. That's where you had to go and live. Whereas in theory, if we go forward 5 or 10 years, any new development of that size, which is most of them these days, will have a few plots that are available for self-builders. So it's an absolute game changer. It really is.
And are you aware of any plots coming available in the Norfolk area on the horizon?
I don't think there are any at the moment, actually, not planned. The Long 4 Acres one was the most recent. As I said a bit earlier, I think the trouble is this is going to take a year or two to come through the system. And I think it's really for people to, partly while we're having this conversation, is to get people to just start to think about it. And if it was a bit cheaper and a lot less risky than it used to be, would it change your view? You might not be living out in kind of splendid isolation in the sticks, but you'll be living in a highly sustainable location next to shops and public transport and schools. It's worth thinking about and getting ready, I think.
So where do we sit in the context of the rest of the country on this legislation?
Well, I would say probably we're a bit off the pace. Not Norfolk specifically, but the east of England has been quite slow to react to increase self-build. The West Country, for some reason, has been much more active, both in terms of service plot quotas on developers, but also treating self-build as a form of affordable housing actually is quite interesting. The fact that we're a bit off the pace has been all the more frustrating because our local MP, Richard Bacon, has actually been a really key figure in pushing this whole agenda through central government or with central government. He introduced a private members bill to get some of the early systems in place, particularly the custom build registers. And in fact, South Norfolk was one of what they call the vanguard councils on self-build. So it was one of the very first to set up its register. But then things seem to sort of stagnate a bit and not much has happened, which is the reason why this new policy is all the more exciting. And Richard Bacon is continuing to push forward on these things. He's just made a major report commissioned by the government, a sort of update on progress, where he talks about, it's quite a technical report, but it looks at all of the different forms of government support. There are tax policies, tax breaks that are being considered, loan funds. They're very keen on the idea of making self-build mortgages much more widely available. So there's a whole lot of stuff that happens in the background. And as I say, Richard Bacon has been really key in making that happen. So I think although we started early and then maybe went off the boil, we're certainly catching up with a vengeance now.
Well, I have to say, having had this conversation, I've hopped over the fence. Whereas I started off thinking, self-build on the edge of a housing development, I'm not sure about that. You've convinced me.
Good. Well, yes, get yourself on your local self-build register and watch this space.